License and registration. Sir now. The young officer's voice cut through the quiet morning. But what she didn't know, that old man on the Harley was more than just an elderly biker. He was a living legend, and the price of her arrogance was about to be paid in full. 100 soldiers, 20 Humvees, and a moment that would echo through the town of Elmridge, Colorado. This isn't just a story about respect, it's about what happens when quiet dignity stands its ground. You won't believe what happens when the truth of his past is unveiled. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Under the steady rumble of his Harley, Franklin Moore rode into Elmridge, Colorado, a small town where everyone knew everyone else by name. He pulled up to the Elmridge fuel stop, its faded signs and cracked pavement familiar to him as the worn leather of his gloves. This was where he liked to start his mornings, just a quick coffee, a nod from Marcus behind the counter, and the sense that the world hadn't quite forgotten men like him. Franklin swung a leg off the bike, his movement slow but sure, the engine's echo settling into silence behind him. He was 82 years old, but he carried himself with the same quiet strength he'd had since the day he first strapped on a uniform. No one at the station that morning would have guessed the stories written in the lines of his face or the steady calm of his eyes. Marcus Grant saw him first, the glass door squeaking as he stepped out with a rag in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "Colonel," Marcus said with a half smile, his own back straightening a little at the sight of the old man. "Morning, Marcus," Franklin replied, the easy familiarity of two veterans who didn't need many words. They exchanged nothing more than a brief nod before Franklin turned back to his bike, checking the worn saddlebag and the faded brass of the tank. But the quiet of the moment didn't last long. A police cruiser rolled into the lot, the crunch of tires on gravel turning every head that had been focused elsewhere. Officer Rachel Carter stepped out, sunglasses reflecting the sun, her posture rigid with the kind of authority that only comes with a badge and the conviction that you know best. Her partner, Officer Daniel Reyes, leaned against the car, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth as he took in the scene. Rachel's voice cut through the air, firm and practiced. "License and registration, sir," she said. Franklin looked at her calmly, pulling out his worn wallet and handing over the documents without a word. He wasn't surprised he'd seen this before. Young officers who thought an old man on a bike was a problem that needed solving. Rachel studied the ID, her brows furrowing as she read his age. 82, she said under her breath, glancing up at him like the number was a personal challenge. She shifted her weight, her hand resting lightly on her holstered weapon. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the bike," she ordered, her tone clipped and cold. Franklin did as she asked, his movements unhurried, every line of his face patient but unyielding. He wasn't here to argue, but he wasn't here to be humiliated either. Reyes walked around the bike, tapping the gas tank with a gloved hand. "This thing's older than my dad," he said with a laugh, glancing back at Rachel. "Hands on the handlebars, feet apart," she commanded, ignoring her partner's joke. The small crowd that always gathered when something unusual happened in town started to drift closer, whispers flickering through the air like static. Marcus watched from the door of the station, his jaw tight, his hand clenching the rag he'd been using to wipe down the counter. He knew Franklin knew the weight of the years that man carried, and he didn't like the way this was playing out. Rachel's questions came one after the other, each one sharper than the last. "Do you have family nearby? Anyone to look out for you?" "I've been taking care of myself for 82 years, Franklin answered evenly. "Do you think you're safe out here on that old bike?" she pressed, her tone rising. Franklin didn't flinch. He'd faced worse than a young officer's suspicion. Reyes chuckled again, leaning in close enough that Franklin could smell the cheap cologne on his uniform. "Think he even hears us," he muttered, but not so soft that Franklin wouldn't catch it. Rachel's mouth tightened, a flush of frustration rising in her cheeks. "Mr. Moore," she said more loudly, her voice edged with impatience. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Franklin kept his eyes steady, his hands still resting calmly on the handlebars. "I hear you just fine," he said, his voice low and even. The tension in the lot crackled like a live wire. No one moved. No one spoke. The quiet was thick enough to feel. Marcus finally stepped forward, his voice rough but steady. "You know he's been riding that bike longer than you've been on this earth," he said. But Rachel didn't even turn her head. Her eyes stayed locked on Franklin, her shoulders squared. "Mr. Moore, you're going to have to come with us," she said. "For your own safety," she added. But the words sounded hollow even as she spoke them. Franklin tilted his head slightly, his expression patient. "And what law says that?" he asked. Rachel hesitated for just a heartbeat, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was the first crack in the hard shell of her authority. Reyes shifted, his smirk slipping just a little as the weight of the moment settled in. The crowd was silent now, every eye on the old man and the officers. It was the kind of silence that said, "This is bigger than just a stop at a gas station." Franklin stood steady, his hands calm on the handlebars, his back straight against the creeping chill of morning. He didn't have to say anything else. Everything about the way he held himself said enough. And in the air around them, something was already starting to change. Franklin kept his calm, even as Rachel Carter's questions grew more pointed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let frustration slip past the steady line of his mouth. He'd learned long ago that dignity was something you carried in your silence as much as your words. Marcus Grant watched from a few feet away, his heart thudding in his chest. He'd seen enough men in uniform to know when respect was being trampled. He wiped his hands on the rag, the old denim soaked with sweat he hadn't felt a minute before. Franklin's voice stayed quiet, every word measured. "I've lived a long life. Officer, always took care of myself." But Rachel wasn't listening. She was already looking for something else, something to prove she was right. Reyes leaned in, his smirk fading into something colder. "Sir, you need to understand," he said, his tone dripping with forced patience. "You're putting yourself and others at risk by riding that thing." Franklin didn't flinch. He just nodded once, a patient gesture that said, "I hear you." But he didn't step back, didn't show fear. Rachel took a breath, her shoulders rising. "I'm recommending a medical evaluation," she said, her voice crisp and certain. "It's for your own good. You're not fit to be on the road like this." Franklin looked at her, his eyes steady and clear. His hands stayed loose on the handlebars, but his gaze never wavered. He didn't need to argue. He had nothing to prove to anyone. In the background, the small crowd was growing. People stood in the shade of the gas station sign, whispers weaving through the air. Some of them frowned. Others just shook their heads. But no one stepped forward. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He knew Franklin better than most knew the kind of man he was. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving with quiet purpose. He stepped away from the door of the station, his eyes still on Franklin as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line clicked twice, then a calm voice answered. "Fort Ridgefield, Communications Office." Marcus kept his voice low, but his words carried the weight of something more than just an old friendship. "This is Marcus Grant, Elmridge Fuel Stop," he said. "I've got a situation here. One of your own is being disrespected." There was a pause on the line, and Marcus could hear the distant murmur of radios and boots on concrete. "Who is it?" the voice asked, calm but firm. Marcus took a breath, his throat tight. "Colonel Franklin Moore," he said, his voice steady. "He's being harassed by local police. He's done nothing wrong." Another pause, longer this time. "Colonel Moore," the voice repeated, the tone shifting. Marcus nodded, even though no one could see him. "Yes. I've known him 15 years. He's a good man. He deserves better than this." On the other end of the line, the voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't let them touch him," the voice said. "We're on our way." Marcus closed the phone, his hands shaking just a little as he slipped it back into his pocket. He looked across the lot, saw Franklin still standing steady, and felt something settle deep in his chest. Help was coming. Back at the bike, Rachel was still pressing, her tone sharp. "You're going to need to come with us, sir," she said again, her voice carrying just enough force to hush the murmurs of the onlookers. "It's a matter of safety. You're endangering yourself and everyone else on this road." Franklin's shoulders shifted, the faintest sigh passing through him. "I've never heard a soul on this bike," he said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. Rachel's jaw clenched, the flush of frustration rising up her neck. She glanced at Reyes, who shrugged like it was no big deal, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, but the way he shifted his weight said he knew they'd gone too far. The crowd was murmuring again, words like unfair and overreach drifting through the cool morning air. Some of them took out their phones, holding them low but recording every word, every flicker of disrespect. The silence between each question felt thicker, heavier. Marcus stood by the edge of the lot, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He didn't speak, didn't move, but his eyes never left Rachel's face. He knew she wouldn't back down, not unless she had no other choice. Franklin shifted his stance just enough to meet Rachel's eyes fully. "There's no law against an old man riding a motorcycle," he said, calm as ever. "I've taken care of myself for 82 years. Officer, today is no different." Rachel didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her breath coming a little faster, the weight of the moment pressing down around her. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she stepped back, her mouth tight, her hand dropping from her holster to her side. "Elder protection law," she said finally, her voice softer but no less firm. "Behavior that puts your own safety at risk. That's what this is about." Franklin let a small, almost invisible smile touch his lips. It wasn't amusement, more like a quiet understanding of how the world worked. He'd heard bigger lies and bigger wars. "I see," he said simply, his tone even. The words didn't fight, they just held their ground. And in that moment, everyone around them could feel it. The air was thick, the silence deep and steady. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket, a single vibration that cut through the tension like a lifeline. He pulled it out, his fingers steady as he read the message. "Hold your ground. We're almost there." He slid the phone away, his shoulders loosening just a fraction. He knew what was coming. The crowd waited, breath held in the quiet before something bigger than them all. Franklin stayed calm, his hands still resting on the handlebars, his eyes clear and patient. Marcus took a step closer to the lot, his heart beating slow and steady. He didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to remind anyone that sometimes respect was something you showed by simply standing still. And across that silent lot, under the wary gaze of two young officers, the promise of something bigger began to rise. The first sign was the low, steady rumble, a vibration in the pavement that grew louder with each second. Eyes turned down the road as 20 Humvees, matte green and dusted with mountain dirt, rolled into view in perfect formation. The convoy cut through the quiet town like a river of purpose, each vehicle moving with the confidence of soldiers who knew exactly why they were here. Franklin stood as still as stone, his eyes locked on the horizon as the first Humvee slowed to a stop. Rachel Carter and Daniel Reyes shifted uneasily, their posture rigid as they watched the line of military vehicles fill the street. The crowd that had been silent now stood breathless, the weight of something far bigger than a traffic stop settling over them. From the lead Humvee stepped Captain Jason Cole, his uniform pressed sharp and metals glinting in the sunlight. He moved with deliberate steps, his eyes locked on Franklin, every inch of him radiating authority earned on battlefields few would ever know. He stopped 3 feet from the old man, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. Captain Cole raised his hand in a crisp salute, his voice clear and full of quiet reverence. "Colonel Franklin Moore," he said, the words ringing out across the lot. His tone carried a weight that made every head in the crowd lift, every breath catch. Rachel's mouth parted, her eyes wide behind mirrored lenses that no longer seemed to shield her uncertainty. Reyes shifted his weight from foot to foot, the smirk gone from his face as he realized just how far out of his depth he was. The silence of the moment was thick, like the world itself had paused to witness what came next. Captain Cole lowered his hand, his expression softening as he spoke again. "Sir, we were informed there was a misunderstanding here," he said, though everyone listening knew this was more than a misunderstanding. He turned his gaze to Rachel and Reyes, the calm in his eyes like a quiet storm. "This man," Captain Cole said, his voice never rising but somehow louder than any shout, "has served in 3 wars. He wears 2 bronze stars and 2 purple hearts, each with 4 oak leaf clusters. He holds a Distinguished Service Cross, the highest honor we can give short of the Medal of Honor itself." Rachel's lips trembled, her hands dropping to her sides as the words cut through the morning air. Reyes swallowed hard, the flush of shame rising on his cheeks. They both looked at Franklin then, truly looked, and saw not an old man on a motorcycle, but a living legend who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Captain Cole let the silence stretch, each word sinking deep. "Colonel Moore is a mentor to men like me," he continued, his tone low and even. "He taught us how to stand when fear tried to break us, how to lead when the night felt endless." The soldiers in the Humvees moved as one, stepping out in perfect synchrony. 100 men and women, their uniforms crisp and their faces solemn, forming a silent line of honor behind their captain. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their boots aligned on the pavement like an unbreakable wall. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she watched them, saw the unwavering respect in every soldier's stance, the quiet fury at the thought of their colonel being treated like a common criminal. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Even Reyes, who had been so quick with his jokes, could only lower his head in shame. Captain Cole turned back to Franklin, his voice softer now, but no less resolute. "Sir," he said, his eyes bright with respect, "you gave your life to this country, and we will always honor that. We will not stand by and watch you be disrespected." Franklin said nothing. He didn't need to. The steady line of soldiers behind Captain Cole said everything that mattered. The captain's gaze swept the crowd, pausing on each face that had gathered to watch. "You're looking at a man who carried more weight on his shoulders than any of us will ever know," he said. "A man who led from the front and never asked for glory only to come home." As he spoke, the soldiers behind him took one step forward in perfect unison. The sound of 100 boots striking pavement echoed through the lot, a single, solid heartbeat of unwavering support. No one watching missed the message. This was not just one old man, they were all standing with him. Rachel took a shaky breath, her eyes meeting Franklin's for the first time without the shield of her authority. She saw the quiet pride in his face, the calm that came from a lifetime of sacrifice and service. And in that look, she saw her mistake laid bare. Reyes shifted again, his mouth opening as if to apologize, but the words died before they reached the air. The weight of what they'd done, what they'd almost turned into a public humiliation, hung heavy around them. The crowd was silent, every person there understanding that they were witnessing something more important than any badge or uniform. Captain Cole stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for Franklin to hear. "Is there anything you need from us, sir?" he asked. "An escort home? Transportation? Anything at all?" Franklin shook his head slowly, a small smile breaking the calm of his features. "No, Captain," he said. "I've been riding this bike longer than most of these kids have been alive. I'll be just fine." Captain Cole nodded once, the corners of his mouth lifting in a quiet smile of his own. "Then we'll stand here as long as you need us to," he said simply, "and we'll make sure the respect you've earned is never questioned again." With that, he stepped back, joining the line of soldiers that had formed behind him. The morning sun caught on the badges and name tapes of 100 uniforms, a quiet testament to the man they stood for. No one spoke. No one dared. In that moment, Franklin swung his leg back over the Harley, the old engine rumbling back to life beneath him. The bike's low growl seemed to echo in the hush of the lot, a sound that spoke of resilience and the roads he still had left to travel. He didn't look back at Rachel or Reyes. He didn't need to. As he rode forward, the soldiers parted like water around a rock, their formation never breaking, their eyes never wavering. They stood in perfect silence, their respect written in every line of their posture, every beat of their hearts. And when Franklin passed between them, it was like watching a living symbol of everything they'd sworn to protect. No one in Elmridge would forget that moment. No one would forget the way a quiet man on an old bike had reminded them all what real honor looked like. And as Franklin disappeared down the road, the convoy of Humvees following at a respectful distance, the town was left with a lesson it would carry for a long, long time. Captain Jason Cole waited a beat longer, the low hum of the Humvees steady in the background. His gaze rested on Franklin, eyes sharp with respect, but soft with something else, an understanding that came from shared years and silent burdens. "Colonel," he said quietly, "is there anything we can do for you? Anything at all?" Franklin looked up at the captain, the smallest glimmer of a smile touching his weathered face. "No, Captain," he said simply. "I've been taking care of myself for 82 years. Today is no different." Captain Cole nodded once, slow and deliberate. His voice dropped, carrying the kind of promise that didn't need a raised tone to be heard. "We'll always be here, sir," he said. "Always." With that, Franklin eased himself back onto his Harley, the old leather seat creaking beneath his weight. He paused for just a breath, letting the moment settle around him, and then he kicked the engine to life. The steady rumble filled the quiet, low and sure, like an old song everyone knew by heart. The soldiers standing in perfect lines didn't move, didn't speak. They simply watched as Franklin guided the bike forward, one slow, measured roll of the wheels at a time. The formation shifted like a tide, opening to create a corridor of honor that led out to the open road. Franklin passed between them, the sun catching on the battered chrome of the Harley's fender. He didn't raise a hand or tip his head. He didn't have to. Respect like that didn't need to be acknowledged with anything but silence. Marcus Grant stood at the edge of the lot, his hand lifted in a small, private salute. He didn't say a word he didn't need to. Franklin had earned this moment long before any of them had been old enough to understand what it meant. As the Harley's roar faded down the road, the soldiers slowly stepped back into their vehicles, boots echoing softly in the cool morning air. Captain Cole gave one last look to the empty lot before turning back to his men. "Mount up," he said, his voice calm. And with the same quiet precision they'd arrived with, the convoy rolled out behind Franklin, each Humvee moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with engines or orders. At the Elmridge Police Department, Captain Cole stood in the sheriff's office, the weight of the morning still settling in his shoulders. Sheriff Thomas Reed, a broad-shouldered man with years carved into his face, listened without interrupting. Captain Cole spoke clearly, each word deliberate. "We're asking for a training program," he said. "Your officers need to understand what it means to serve, to see past the years, past the scars, and recognize the quiet sacrifices that built this country." Sheriff Reed nodded once, the lines around his eyes deep with thought. "It'll be done," he said. "Every officer, every badge. They'll learn." Captain Cole held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. "Good," he said simply. "Because men like Colonel Moore shouldn't have to prove themselves again, not here, not anywhere." 1 week later, the quiet of the Elmridge countryside was broken only by the distant whir of cicadas and the lowing of cattle in the fields. Officer Rachel Carter turned her cruiser up the winding dirt road that led to Franklin's modest farm. The old barn leaned a little in the sun. Its red paint faded to a soft rust, but the place felt alive, solid. Rachel stepped out, her boots crunching in the gravel. She walked slowly, her breath steady but her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Franklin ahead, working near the barn door, his back bent as he checked the worn hinges. "Colonel Moore," she called out, her voice quiet but clear. Franklin straightened, turning to face her, a faint smile in his eyes. "Officer Carter," he said evenly, "you come to finish what you started." Rachel's cheeks flushed, her shoulders stiff. "No, sir," she said softly. "I came to apologize." She took a slow breath, letting the words come. "I didn't see you. Not really. I let a badge tell me more about a man than the lines on his face or the calm in his voice ever could." Franklin watched her for a moment, the faintest twinkle in his eyes. He didn't speak right away, didn't rush her. Finally, he gave a small nod, the lines at the corners of his mouth deepening with a quiet smile. "Chow no nay," he said, his voice as gentle as the early morning air. "Don't ever judge a man by what you see in front of you. You never know what wars he's fought or who he fought them for." Rachel lowered her head, the weight of the lesson resting on her shoulders like a yoke. "Thank you, sir," she said simply. "I'll remember." Franklin didn't answer, just gave a small nod before turning back to the barn. Rachel stood there a moment longer, the sun warm on her face, and then she walked back to her cruiser, the lesson etched in the silence between them. The next morning, the town of Elmridge woke to a quiet that felt different. People moved a little slower, their conversations softer, as if the memory of what they'd seen still lingered in the air. Marcus poured coffee at the station, his hands steady, his eyes thoughtful. He knew that some moments didn't need to be retold to be remembered. Franklin Moore eased the Harley out of his barn just as the first light of day touched the tips of the pines. The old bike rumbled to life beneath him, a sound that had carried him through decades and would carry him still. He pulled onto the dusty road, the leather of his jacket creaking as he settled into the seat. As he rode past the fields, the wind caught the edges of his hair, white as snow but strong as ever. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him he hadn't already faced. And in that quiet ride through the edge of dawn, he carried with him the knowledge that honor doesn't need to be shouted from rooftops. It only needs to be seen. It only needs to be remembered. And in Elmridge, Colorado, that morning, it was. Franklin rode on, the low growl of the Harley steady and sure, a promise whispered into the waking world. The town watched him go, the memory of his quiet dignity stitched into every sunrise that would come after. And in the hush of that early hour, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.